Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I will be showing you a game between Mikhail Tal, who is just one of the greatest players of all time, and Hans-Joachim Hecht. This game was played in 1962 in the Varna Olympiad, and the opening is the Queen's Indian / Nimzo-Indian hybrid. So it's just basically the Queen's Indian defense and the Nimzo-Indian defense. But there's also one more thing that I must tell you. I have a little cupcake that will be analyzing this game with me. Okay, so back to the game. White opens with pawn to d4, and black develops his knight to f6. White pushes his other pawn to c4, and black pushes his own pawn to e6. Then white develops his own knight to f3, and then black pushes the pawn to b6, which is the Queen's Indian defense. Then after this, white develops his other knight to c3, and then black plays bishop to b4, like the Nimzo-Indian defense. And I also guess the Bogo-Indian defense, but Bogo-Indian defense usually comes with a bishop check on b4, but this is not check because the white knight is in the way. So, after bishop to b4, white develops his own bishop to g5. And then black develops his other bishop to b7. And after bishop to b7, white pushes his pawn to e3. Then black pushes his own pawn to h6. Then white retreats his bishop to h4 while keeping the pin on the black knight with bishop to h4. Then black takes the white knight on c3 with check, capturing the white knight. White gets revenge. B takes d3, capturing the bishop. And then after b takes d3, black pushes the pawn to d6. And then white moves the knight to d2. Then black pushes his pawn to e5. Then white pushes his own pawn to f3. Then black plays queen to e7. And then white pushes his pawn to e4. So white has a massive clump of central pawns. And pawns defending the central pawns. And after this, after e4, black develops the knight on b8 to d7. And then after knight d7, white develops his other bishop to d3. Then black plays a little inaccuracy, but it's a logical move. Knight to f8. Then white plays a here Tal plays a typical Tal pawn sacrifice, like c5, like typical sacrifice, like classic. Black takes the white pawn on c5 with his pawn on d6. Then white takes back with d takes e5. And then after that, d takes e5, not d takes c5. And then after d takes e5, black takes the white pawn on e5 with the queen on e5. And then after that, white plays queen to a4, check. Then black blocks the check with pawn to c6. And then, after this, white plays a good move, castling. Now, defending the c pawn on c3 would be too slow because black has kept his knights active. And then black plays knight to g6, which attacks the bishop on h4. And then white moves the knight to c4, and this move is a counterattack. It's hitting the black queen on e5. And then black retreats the queen to e6. Now white plays another good move, pawn to e5. And after pawn to e5, Black plays a good move, pawn to b5, so another counterattack. And then after that, white takes the black knight with his pawn on f6. And then black plays a little inaccuracy. He just takes the white queen. Like, it's a free queen, but after that, white plays f takes g7. We just took another pawn. No, a pawn on g7. And then black plays rook to g8. But then white plays a brilliant move. I will give you 10 seconds or some time to figure it out. Pause the video if you want to try to figure it out. Okay, so the move played was bishop to f5. And then black plays knight takes the bishop on h4. And then white takes the black queen on e6. And then black plays bishop to a6. And then white moves the knight to d6, was check. Black moves the king to e7 to escape the check. And then white retreats the bishop to c4. And then black takes the pawn on g7 with his rook, finally. Then after rook takes g7, we see pawn to g3 from white. Then after pawn to g3, black takes the knight on d6 with his king. Then after that, white takes the bishop on a6 with his own bishop. And then black moves the knight to f5. And like rook b8 is a better try for black. But instead black played knight to f5. And after that, white moved the rook on a1 to b1. Then black pushed the pawn to f6. And then white moved the rook on f1 to d1, was check. To escape the check, black moved his king to e7. Then white moved his rook to e1, was another check. Then black moved his king back to d6. Then white moved his king to f2. And then after that, black pushed his pawn to c4. And after pawn to c4, white pushed his own pawn to g4. Then black retreated his knight to e7. And after knight to e7, white played rook to b7. And now, this move, rook to b7, in my opinion, it's a very active move. Like white's pieces are very active, right? Like the rooks. But also, this move makes use of his active pieces to tie black down and prevent any counterplay. But then, black moves rook from a8 to g8. And then after that, white takes the pawn on c4 with his bishop. Then after bishop takes c4, black moved knight to d5. And then after knight to d5, white took the black knight with his bishop. And then after that, after bishop takes e5, black took back with the c pawn on d5. And after c takes d5, white moved the rook back to b4. So now this is just a double rook endgame. And after rook to b4, black plays rook to c8. And after rook to c8, white takes the pawn on a4. Then black takes the white pawn on c3. And after rook takes c3, white moves the rook to a6. Then black moves the king to c5 to escape the check. And then after king to c5, white took the black pawn on f6. And then after rook takes f6, black pushes the pawn to h5. Then after h5, white moves the pawn to h3. And then black took the pawn on g4 with his own pawn. Then white took back with his own h-pawn. Then after H takes. Black played rook to h7. Then white played pawn to g5. Passed pawns must be pushed, as they say. Then black played rook to h5. Then after rook to h5, white played rook to f5, which defends a pawn on g5. Then black played rook to c2 check. Then white played king to d3 to escape the check. And then black moved the king to c4. And then white moved the rook on e1 to e5. And then black pushed his passed pawn to d4. And then white pushed his own passed pawn to g6. And after g6, black moved the rook out of danger to h1. And after rook to h1, white moved the rook to c5, was check. And then black plays king to d3. And then white took the black rook with his own rook. And black took the white rook with his king. And then after that, white moved his king up to f4. And then black moved his rook to g1. Then white played rook to g5. And then black resigned. And after this d3, g7, d2, g8, queen, d1, queen, and after that, white would play queen to b3, and that forces the exchange of queens. And then white would just promote this pawn on f3. In my opinion, this game was a beautiful double rook endgame by Mikhail Tal. And Mikhail Tal was a great attacking player. And a famous quote from Mikhail Tal is, "There are two types of sacrifices, good ones and mine." Because Mikhail Tal was famous for his unique sacrifices. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing.